Hey friends, I've already spoken with Rob Renfroe. He's the president of Good News, which is a very influential group in the people called Methodist. He's been their president and publisher since 2009, and he's been involved in United Methodist Renewal Reform for many years. Before that, having served as president of the board of directors for the Confessing Movement before being at Good News. He's a graduate of Rice University, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and then he served at the Woodlands UMC for at least 16 years, a huge church in Texas. And so he's been all over. He's done a lot of things. He's one of the names that I read for many years before starting PlainSpoken. And if you want to see our first conversation, we did that in October of last year, right after things turned to such a mess in the Middle East. And of course, a lot of things have happened since then. Namely, Rob was over at Charlotte for the 2 weeks of General Conference and served there alongside Tom Lambrecht and a few other faithful Westerners alongside of many faithful Africans as the denomination was essentially, in biblical terms, given over to itself. So a lot of people distraught and distressed right now, and I thought it was maybe a good way for me to use my platform to speak with him and other conservative leadership to figure out how it is we might best kind of process what's taken place and what hope there is and what there is to take joy in, even if it's a pretty obvious defeat for biblically faithful believers in the United Methodist Church. And, for better or for worse, the United Methodist Church has the brand of Methodism. They are the biggest group. And so what is to be said and done about all this? Rob is gracious to give me some of his wisdom after pouring himself out for 2 weeks straight. And so at this point, Rob, I just want to thank you for spending time with me and my audience and greet you. How are you today, brother?
I'm doing great, and it's really a pleasure to be with you, Jeffrey. I enjoyed our first conversation, enjoyed checking in and seeing all that you're putting out, and you're very prolific, and how you do it, I don't know, but I'm grateful for all that you do. So good being with you.
Yeah, I have no idea how I do it. I wonder that sometimes, and the hours add up, and I give less in some places and more in others, but God has really blessed me with a very productive wife and some wonderful children that I still get to hang out with, and I love being able to do stuff like this because I know a lot of people are very interested to know. Right. What you are thinking, what you're going through, and how you see things, because a lot of people, they just get snippets, but they don't have the phone numbers of all the people that you do. They don't get to witness the conversations that you do. And so perhaps a good way for us to start would be for you to give just kind of a basic report on what happened in the last couple weeks as you perceived it.
Well, what happened really is what we thought would happen. So, as you said, it was a, quote, defeat, and if you look at all of the issues that we cared about, that is what it was. Good news, the WCA, we worked together very closely during this general conference, and we were very upfront that unlike past general conferences where we had a whole litany of issues that we cared about and we were trying to encourage people to vote a certain way regarding, we cared about whether or not our African brothers and sisters and others outside the United States were going to be given the same right to discern their future, to disaffiliate if they desired to, that we in the U.S. were given. We cared about that because that's an issue of justice. And we also cared about regionalization. Other issues we knew were going to not go our way. We had some small hope that those issues that we might be able to convince people to be just and fair to our brothers and sisters outside the United States. That didn't happen. So I tell people, I've been to 9 general conferences, 7 as one of the leaders of our traditionalist coalition. And I tell people out of all of those, this was the least stressful because we didn't expect to win anything. In the past ones, we hoped to, we worked to, we thought if we did everything right and God blessed us that we would prevail on some very key important biblical issues, and we did, but it was very stressful, at least it was for me, because I knew people were counting on us. Here, there wasn't much stress because we knew we weren't going to win much of anything. But it was discouraging and somewhat depressing as you saw what used to be a great church, a church that I cared about deeply, gave my life to as long as many others did, as well as many others did. You just saw it walking further and further away from our traditional Orthodox Christian faith, from the gift that the Wesley brothers gave to us, centuries ago.
Yeah, I was writing this down because I didn't want to forget it. As you say, it was less stressful than in previous years.
Right.
The thought you give makes sense, but the thing that was also different that would have really stressed me out was the open hostility towards you personally, but also towards conservatives more broadly, from the opening shots with Tom Bickerton saying that if you're not with them, then you need to get out of the room, to the most hostile thing was the sermon from the young lady from Florida that spoke on behalf of young people. It was just a really nasty tirade. And in previous general conferences, they've at least had to behave in a genteel and somewhat respectful way, even if there were little jabs under the surface. It was open warfare, and they were gloating over. It would have been so hard for me and my conscience to remain silent in the face of such open disrespect. And I found myself wondering, because I restreamed their live stream with commentary, and I watched so many instances of them behaving so horribly towards. I mean, they didn't call you out by name, although I think they might have been referring to you at one point. But
Sure.
they were so petty and smarmy that I just imagined. I wonder what Rob is going through as he listens to and sees all this. I wonder if you're just serene in your spirit because you stand on the side of right, or if you found yourself, sure, there wasn't as much conflict in your spirit about getting all the different legislative stuff figured out, but if you were more conflicted in a different way, just going, really, this is how you guys are going to end things? What's to be said about that?
Well, this isn't the first time that we've been criticized. So, I've been doing this for decades now. And the folks on the other side, not all of them, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but many of their chief spokesmen and women, they make it very personal. They attack your person, your integrity, your Christian character. So this was not new. And what I've learned to do is to consider the source. If people that I respect and people that I think very highly of, if they are critical of me, and usually when that happens, there hasn't been much, but when they do it the right way. They speak to me personally and say, Rob, you could have done this better. But when I consider the source and I think about their theological commitment, when I consider their character, their track record, and then there's another salvo, it's never fun, but it doesn't stick with you in a deep way. It's not nearly as personally challenging as they wish it was, because you just know we're two different tribes. You know that people who are hurt lash out and try to hurt other people. So it's not nearly as bothersome as some people think. Plus, having a good team of people like Tom Lambrecht, Steve Beard, Scott Field was with us, and others, that all kind of helps relieve the sense of trying to make it more personal than it needs to be. But I will tell you, Jeffrey, what was amazing, and you mentioned Bickerton's opening address, is how much we are still in their heads. I mean, this was his opportunity to project a vision for this new United Methodist Church. And he spent a good portion of it, I don't know, 20% of it, pointing fingers at people who had sown division and misunderstanding and went through the whole litany, and basically telling us that we didn't have a reason or right to be there, that we should just leave. And I thought, this is really amazing. If I had the opportunity to speak at this general conference, I don't think I would have mentioned a word about the past. I would have talked about our opportunity to be the church that we believe that God is calling us to be. I would have spoken about the desperate need of this world for the gospel of Jesus Christ, and how we now are free of distractions to pursue wholeheartedly what God is calling us to be and what God's calling us to do. But his message was one pointing fingers, and then he immediately pivoted and said that we shouldn't point fingers, which was just so lacking in self-awareness. But then he just went on and kind of told the kids, hey, we're going to be okay. And I get that. They feel like they've been hurt, and they feel like they've been done wrong, and there's some reason for healing. But man, there was no sense of passion for becoming a anointed, powerful instrument of God in this world that desperately needs the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Oh, Bickerton's got some passion. He's got some passion for hating on people like me and you. I still remember his state of the church that he did last year, and just the lack of self-awareness. This is something that I'm going to bring us back to here in a little bit, because Bickerton is far from the only one lacking self-awareness here.
Don't let me get us off, but I will tell you that I have noticed that many progressives are exactly who they say we are. They are closed-minded. They are right. Everybody else is wrong. They are judgmental. If you don't see it their way, it's because you're a bad person, or because you don't really have the Spirit of Christ, whatever terminology they want to use. So it's just been amazing to me that who they think we are is merely a projection of themselves. Again, just total lack of self-awareness and introspection, I think.
James Lindsay has called it the iron law of woke projection, and I find that it often fits. So we'll come back to that here in a little bit, but I wanted to, I spent more than a dozen hours poring over, commenting over plenary sessions, and those are very revealing as to what's going on behind the scenes in some ways, but far from sufficient in really understanding what's going on under the surface. So that's just the surface. That's just what boils to the surface. One cannot help but wonder, what is going on behind the scenes? Are they seeing the same things that I'm seeing? Are they as anxious about, so you've very helpfully already said our agenda was not the same as at previous. We were not trying to defend the faith from this progressive onslaught. We had a 2-point agenda. Really, your main agenda was just figure out disaffiliations for those left behind. But then the Africans were also clear that they wanted to resist regionalization. Failed. Go ahead.
Many of them were. There's some fragmentation among the Africans regarding regionalization. There's not any fragmentation regarding marriage being one man and one woman. But that's where, and I don't know how we can. I don't want to go into that just yet. What I did want to ask you was, you were there the whole time, operating behind the scenes, talking with people, seeing what was going on. What were things, you can talk about anecdotes, you can talk about broad brush strokes, but things that are helpful for people to know about what was going on behind the scenes that we didn't see on the cameras at Plenary? Well, you probably saw it the way I did, whether people realized the difference or not. This was the most scripted, most controlled general conference that any of us had ever experienced. They now are unified. There are no voices on the Council of Bishops that are trying to really uphold anything that is traditional. I'm not saying that there aren't any traditional bishops. There may be one or two still that fall into that category. But the centrist, liberal, progressive wing is fully in control. So they had, for example, determined who would be able to speak. Jerry Kula wanted to make a statement after the definition of marriage was changed, and he was told he could not do that by the Commission on General Conference, that he would have to write out his speech, turn it in to them. They would then decide if it was approved or not, and if it was, or what parts they determined were approved, they would then read it for him. Now, we've never seen anything like that. Points of personal privilege were very common in the past. As a matter of fact, if you know anything about the history of General Conference, you know that our bishops worked with those that were promoting an LGBTQIA agenda, allowing them to come within the bar of the conference when the rules said that they were not permitted to do that, negotiating with them so that they would, the LGBTQIA leaders would be given their time to not just demonstrate on the floor, but to address the conference from the mic. And so giving an opportunity for the minority voices to be heard, even to be projected to the entire conference in an official way, that's been a part of what we've done before. But now that the roles have reversed in terms of who has power, just the leader of the African delegation, that may be a little overstatement, but Jerry's certainly one of the leaders, was not even allowed, when asking properly, to be able to speak. Maria Dixon Hall at SMU, who I think would describe herself as a progressive, she's certainly not a traditionalist, tweeted out that this is the first time that I have felt like there's an inside group running this thing that I'm not a part of. And that's close to verbatim. But she was giving voice to what the rest of us felt. There's a group that has decided what's going to be allowed. It's going to fit our agenda. It's not going to allow for real dissension. We're not going to give room for those voices. So this was controlled, it was scripted, and, that's what power does. It exerts itself, and now that they are in power, that's who they've shown themselves to be. So that was really the kind of beneath the scenes dynamic that was very different and very visible to those who had eyes to see.
I don't really like people who have like a victim mentality or like too obsessed with like safety and fragility and stuff. But
Right.
Having started PlainSpoken, I've thought about, what if I drove down to Charlotte and set up a little table there and tried to interview people? And, my main reason for not doing that is, I'm a family guy and I like staying close to home. I'm not going to leave my wife with the 4 kids and very pregnant.
Right.
But another thing that came into my head is I do not want some gay activists getting in my face with their purple hair and screaming hysterically, right, and me wondering, am I going to have to punch this person in the face? Because I'm not entirely sanctified yet. And I've wondered if, I don't know what the convention centers look like at these things. I don't know how much the people interact with each other, but I have wondered if you and Tom, and in previous years, Mark and other caucus leaders, if you've ever felt like things are so volatile as to actually risk violence behind the scenes.
I won't say that thought hasn't occurred to me, but I don't want to make it worse than it is. You do have people come up and tell you what great harm you're doing, what a despicable person you are, sneer at you, things of that nature. I do remember at the end of 2019, I don't know if you know Jeff Greenway, who
Yes.
has been an athlete and is a big old boy. At the end of it, and we were going to have to get through the crowds, he says, "Rob, get behind me and I'll block for you." So he was my pulling guard to get me through there unmolested and unbothered. So there's certainly that in the back of your mind. I tell you the truth, Jeffrey, we made a decision that we would spend as little time as possible at the convention center. We know how people see us. They loathe us. They detest us. We are their villain, and we can do our work from. We always at General Conference we rent a couple of rooms, and one of them is our workroom where we have a projector and a screen, and we're able to watch General Conference live, and we're able on the phone, whether it's WhatsApp or texting or phone calls, to connect with delegates and others that way. We, in the past, would spend more time sitting up in the gallery, but here we just decided that our presence would not be appreciated, and we didn't want anything that had a traditional appeal to it. We didn't want that associated with us, because we know people think we have created disinformation, division, etc. So anything we hoped for, especially for our African and other regional conference brothers and sisters, we didn't want that tainted with our appearance. So we kept our distance more than we ever had.
It's probably wise. Yeah, that's a big part of what I was wondering is Rob in that room? What is he doing as people are looking at him and talking about him and sneering at him? And so I'm kind of relieved to know that scenario was not really something that you had to deal with. It is really wonderful to be able to do remote work and to still make a contribution. So the thing that I wondered most about behind the scenes, it was very clear to me that the legitimacy of this general conference was already in question because of low African participation and what I would consider to be, I mean, when they calculate the delegates the way that they did, and you have just this huge overrepresentation of progressives, don't even represent grassroots of United Methodism in America, then it seems to me that the Africans were actually in a very powerful position at the General Conference, where if after a couple of days of the progressives showing that they were not going to play nice, that they were going to completely just bulldoze them,
right,
it seemed to me that the most sensible thing was for the Africans en masse to just get up and say, this is not a legitimate General Conference. The best they could do was Forbes Matanga, at the last day or second to last day, said this assembly doesn't represent what's going to be the global majority, what already is the global majority right now. And we're not, I forget what kind of conclusion that he made, but that is an undeniable fact. And so I find myself wishing that the African delegation, along with the sympathetic Filipinos, although they were represented, but I wish that the Africans had gotten up and just said, we've been too disenfranchised, this is not a legitimate gathering, we're going home. Why didn't that happen? Help me understand.
I think, in all honesty, Jeffrey, we have some bishops there who have decided to play ball with the UMC. Now, we can think what their motives are. I can give them good motives. I can give them motives that are not admirable. But they have made inroads into their delegation. They have done a good job of demonizing Africa Initiative and the WCA, and really giving out misinformation about what those groups are about. And so they didn't have the same force, Africa Initiative, to unify people as they have in the past. In addition to what I said, some of the bishops replaced elected delegates with those that were more favorable to a regionalization, let's stay together. So I don't think that there was the unanimity in everybody being on the same page to begin with, and I think that there would have been, if to pull something off like that, you have to believe that everybody or almost everybody is going to get up and walk out with you. And I think because of the games that some of the African bishops have played there, that there wasn't that certainty that if this was called for, they would all be able to have that kind of overwhelming response. Some of them know that their bishops have threatened them, and they're afraid that if they were to do something like that, they might be removed from their pastorates or suffer other kinds of recrimination. So I think it was just much more fluid this time than other times.
That makes
They did.
sense. Go ahead.
Did, as you know, they made a statement that did give voice. It was a statement that Jerry Kulow wanted to make on the conference floor, but was denied that opportunity. But they did make that statement before the conference was over.
Are you talking about the press conference they put on?
Yeah.
Yeah, my frustration with that was there were only 5 names on that document, and when they presented it at the press conference, I think there were only 10 African bodies standing with him. And
No.
Go ahead.
Then you didn't get to see the whole crowd. There were more than that standing around in the crowd. And the 5 names there were just contacts. It was like if reporters wanted to follow up, that's who they could contact.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It's just with the statement that they put out when they gathered in, was it Nairobi?
Yeah.
That also lacked, what should have been conveyed. Whenever I'm king of the Methodists, here's what I'll do different. But they should have had the names of all of the delegates that were in attendance there, so that one could really see the size and integrity of them, as opposed to that group in Tanzania that gathered, where they said they had all the African delegates, but they didn't.
Right.
So there needed to be. What's unfortunately been the case is that the powers that be have been able to manipulate information so that they've been able to create the impression that the Africans are as divided as the Americans, and really there is no unanimity around homosexuality or regionalization. Africa Initiative did speak with one voice, but they didn't demonstrate the unanimity that they represent. And I hear you saying that they did not have unanimity as a general African delegation this year for many reasons, but they still represent what is almost a unanimous African disposition when removed from the bishop's influence. So the fact that they were not able to convey that is just so disappointing to me, because it is clear to me that they stand on the side of right. It is clear to me that transparency works in their favor, and I just hate knowing that and it's not just Africans. Americans also, conservative Americans, have also been cowed by the threats of those in authority. And in Africa, granted, bishops have much more authority and power in Africa than they do in America. And I understand that. I still, I was told, I don't know if you can confirm or deny this, that Mande Muyombo, Bishop of North Katanga, replaced some of their delegates with family members that he brought to vote. Is this something that you are aware of?
I didn't hear family members.
Okay.
And again, this is hearsay, so I can't give you actual, can't quote chapter and verse. But we were told by some in the Congo that, he did replace delegates with those who were more in line with his thinking, his desire to go along and to stay United Methodist and embrace regionalization.
Yeah, he was a big figure, and then the second biggest figure is Ande Emmanuel, who is in Nigeria and is single-handedly responsible for all the nastiness there, where half of their delegation didn't even get invited. That was legitimate. So the thing that incensed me was the Committee on Credentials give this report saying the Africans didn't do the process correctly, and that's why we didn't send invites. But the ones that were corrupt got all their invites, and then the ones that did it legitimately got disenfranchised by a puppet like Andy. And so the thing that's infuriating about that is there's truth to it, but it's inverted. It created go ahead.
Here was my reaction to the report that was given. And kudos to the General Conference for saying, hey, this doesn't look right. There were some centrists, Lonnie Brooks being a good one, and others who said, hey, we're missing a lot of Africans. This doesn't look right. This conference, you could argue, is not even legitimate. So they had to give a report, and the report was this. Hey, we had a hard time getting names. So it turned out that the job that we had was pretty difficult, and so we just didn't do it. That was
then they spent the last day patting themselves on the back for 45 minutes at plenary when they had better things to talk about. Man, just an infuriating. Go ahead.
Well, I thought, if this was somebody giving a report to a board of directors, and it said, "Hey, we've got a quarter of our the majority of Methodists live in Africa, and a quarter of them, their delegates, their representatives aren't coming. How do you explain that?" And you say to your board of directors, "Well, it turned out it was pretty hard getting those names." Well, you had since 2019, right? Well, 5 years, yeah, but it just, it was difficult to make happen, so we didn't do it. Those folks would be not, applauded for nice effort. They would be fired, and somebody who thought their job was important enough to do it would be put in their place. If you can't get names, call the bishop up and say, "Hey, I can't get with the conference secretary. Can you give me these names, or can you get the conference secretary to call me?" "Oh, I still can't get them?" "Well, this is important. I'm going to get on an airplane. The airplanes fly from the United States to Africa every day. I'm going to get on an airplane. I'm going to go and find out who this person is and get these names. Somebody's in the hospital," was one of the excuses. "Tell me what hospital. I'll go talk with that person and find out where to get this list of names." I heard years ago somebody use this example. So when people tell you, well, they couldn't get it done, say, if I had said, "If you get this done, I could give you $1 million," would you have found a way to do it? Could you have gotten it done? "Oh, well, of course I could have." Well, then it's not really undoable. It's just that you lack the will or the passion or the determination. And that's exactly what that report was. It was blaming Africa when instead, again, no introspection, no self-reflection, and no honesty. It didn't matter enough to us to do this. I'll get off this, Jeffrey, but last summer, I contacted a bishop and said, "We got a problem here. And many of our Africans are not getting their invitation letters. They're telling us it's months and months before they can get an interview to be able to get their visa. We got to do something." And the bishop got back and said, "I spoke with somebody and they say they're working on it." But people from Africa sent letters or emails, contacted the Commissioner on General Conference with the same news. Many times they didn't even hear back, weren't even given the courtesy of a response. So it's like our job was hard. We decided not to do it. We didn't even respond to people who said, "Hey, we're having a problem." So that kind of tells you that, and not giving the Africans and others, I keep saying Africans, the majority of the church outside of the United States, but not giving those outside of the United States the same right and privilege to discern what God's will for their churches are and to disaffiliate if they go through the right process. The right and privilege that was given to us in the United States was denied to our African and Filipino and other brothers and sisters outside the United States.
And just to anticipate any lefties who watch this and want to argue, should acknowledge, yes, in paragraph 572, there is a provision for annual conferences and or central conferences to go through a process to disaffiliate, become affiliated autonomous. That is not the same thing as allowing individual congregations to have a right to disaffiliate. It doesn't even remotely scratch the same itch, and it's disingenuous to act as though you or someone else is lying when you say that the exact same rights were not afforded on the outside.
You're 100% correct. And what they also don't tell you is that a bishop can work as hard as possible to preclude that conference from leaving. Even if they take a vote, they have to get it passed by the Standing Committee on Central Conferences. All of the annual conferences and their central conference has to vote for it. And then the general conference can still deny it. It can be stopped 3 or 4 different times, even if they do everything properly. So to act like, and it will take years to get done. So
I found myself getting really frustrated, and I think I would love him personally, but with Bishop Kigai, who went through this whole process and was able to get Central Asia disaffiliated, and then gave this very very gentle and kind and wonderful
Right.
speech. I mean, in another general conference, in another setting, I think it would have been a wonderful thing to do. But
Right.
what he did effectively in that case was gave license to progressives to pat themselves on the back and feel as though they hadn't done anything wrong.
You
And
know, Keygate has a problem that you and I don't have, and that is he has a good, kind, and gracious nature. That's not you and me, Jeff.
okay,
We are not plagued with that, and so we can just call things straight out and don't feel a need to tell people how wonderful they are. Now, he's been a champion, so we're kind of tongue in cheek here. But he's a gracious person, and you and I, and he responded probably the way that a statesman should. But you and I know that what you said is exactly right. It did allow progressives and centrists to think, well, aren't we gracious and wonderful? It works for them. Why doesn't it? Why wouldn't it work for others? And their particular situation is very different than those in Africa. They had folks over them that were willing to negotiate this, and some African bishops are not willing to do that at all.
yeah, I meant to highlight when you were talking about the nature of these bishops. Muyombo's not the only. I mean, Muyombo is the loudest and the most obnoxious
Right.
and troublesome one. But Nyatiwa gave the Zimbabwean bishop gave a
Right.
sermon that was just blatantly materialistic at the general conference and ambivalent to issues of Christian morality. I couldn't
Yeah.
believe. I don't know. I mean, he must be so secure in his position in order to say that and know it's going to get back to Africa and still think that he's going to maintain his standing among his countrymen. I was embarrassed for him.
Yeah, it didn't play well. It was kind of like, well, the United Methodist Church has given us money, and the United Methodist Church has given us treasures, and the United Methodist Church has given us trinkets. So haven't they been good to us? And it did not play well with the Africans. That he was a butt of many jokes and some real ire when they saw what he was doing. They just felt it made him look bad, made them look bad. And as the African statement said, in Africa, the gospel of Jesus Christ is not for sale. And we don't care how much you give us, we're not going to let go of what the scriptures teach us to be true about God and his will. So that was a kind of I wouldn't say a backhanded way of addressing Niwatiwa, but it spoke to his speech. It certainly did.
So whenever I'm speaking about Africans, I'm doing so primarily from knowing Simon Mafunda through considering Charlotte. I did a series of interviews with people from the African continent and the United Methodist Church. I've had some private correspondences. I'm on a WhatsApp group. Your experience with African United Methodists is much more extensive than mine, to the degree that you've flown to the African continent, been a part of several different meetings behind closed doors and out in the open with African delegates. And so as people are hearing you talking about it, us talking about it, I'm not on the inside, but I'm also not just some guy
Right.
reading a bunch of articles and speaking to it. You actually have been on the inside, linking arms with your brothers in Christ from Africa. You can speak in an informed way about the conversations going on behind closed doors,
Yeah.
the drafting of documents, the speeches
Right.
given, you just now spoke to how it is that Africans are speaking about Bishop Nyatiwa, and whenever you're speaking in that way, it's not as some person on the outside who's speculating. You've been in the room with people as they've been digesting
Right.
this information together.
Yeah, so I've been to Africa 5 times, and most recently was with about 30 of their leaders. This was in September last fall, and then right before General Conference in first week of April, we were there with over 100 delegates there and spent a good 3 days both times there with people. So we had a good chance to understand them. Plus, we met practically continuously throughout General Conference with their leaders. and listening to them, understanding their concerns. And one thing I'll tell you, Jeffrey, I said that for me and for, I think, Tom and other leaders, this was the least stressful, but in a way the most depressing. That's not how the Africans that we work with responded. We were at one meeting, and everything was going against what they wanted. They weren't being allowed to speak. And I said, listen, I know things aren't going well, but I don't want you to be discouraged. We appreciate you. You're standing up for what's true, et cetera, et cetera. And a couple of them just cut me off, and they said, we're not discouraged. We're not down. They said, we're happy. They said, we've been telling people this is who the United Methodist Church is. And many in Africa don't believe us. What they didn't say is we are so far away from Orthodox Christianity that when I tell people where the United Methodist Church really is, it's like I'm trying to convince them that, the moon is made out of green cheese. It's like you're just fooling, or you're an idiot to make these kinds of claims. They said, but we're happy now because they now see for themselves who the United Methodists are. And they said, this makes our job easier. They also reported they had started getting messages from Africa saying, okay, you were right, I was wrong, what do we do now? So this helps them go back and make their case that it's time for Orthodox Christians who happen to be Wesleyan Methodists, United Methodists in Africa, it's time for them to leave. And we think, if this works for you, Jeffrey, just like disaffiliation here was somewhat moderated by your particular annual conference, your geography, the same thing's going to be true in Africa. We think there are between 1 and maybe 5 entire annual conferences that will leave. We think there are others where numerous churches will leave. We think there are some who have hopes of electing a new bishop over the next, it may turn out 8 or 9 months, that will be in favor of disaffiliation. And so they're likely to hang in there and try to see how that election goes. So just in the same way that here, using 2553, it took different churches and annual conferences, it took them different amounts of time to figure out what was best for them, and they took different routes to get to where they ultimately were. That's going to happen in Africa as well. And what we decided here is that we were going to not be judgmental of those who left first, that they just decided I'm out, and we were going to be gracious to those who came later. And so you're going to have some first out over there, and many
well, you've
of
already
them,
had them in Kenya, Ethiopia.
Yeah, and when we were in Nairobi last September, there were others who said, we know how it's going to go, let's just leave now. And so they were ready to go. Then others said, like exactly what happened, let's wait until Charlotte, and then we'll be able to tell people this is why we've got to go, and we'll take more with us. So just like we had you have different personalities as well as different situations regarding your annual conference, they're going to have that there. And we're going to be very understanding and trust that these are our brothers and sisters. These are, when I say committed Christians, they're so far beyond, where we are in terms of what they're willing to do to be faithful to Christ and their passion for the gospel. I've kind of joked, man, if our African brothers and sisters are the competition for getting a good seat in the banquet hall of heaven, I hope there's a patio somewhere out there where I can end up getting a seat, you know. So we're going to trust them to know what's right for their situation, to fight the good fight, and to get to the GMC as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's where I'm really interested in. I don't know if we can circle back to this, but I want to make sure that culturally the Global Methodist Church is of a very different disposition so far as how it does. I want us to hand over the reins of authority and power to Africa in a way that America should have and ran away from as quickly as possible. I mean, I was so embarrassed for them at this general conference, because it clearly was the time for them to hand the reins of the institution over to the Africans. And in the
Well, that's
months before that, Mark Holland said, no, we give the majority of money. There's no way we're going to let them have the purse strings. That seems blatantly racist to me. And I thought, surely they have the sensibilities to know that that is the voice of the evil one.
right.
I'm not saying Mark is the devil. I'm saying that that particular insight is from the evil one. And they did not have that discernment. And so that was the direction I knew we needed to go here, was the lack of discernment in the United Methodist Church. I found appalling. I cannot fathom the lack of discernment and self-awareness on the part of leadership and the people who prop up the leadership. I find that so distressing, and we can have none of that in the Global Methodist Church. But I wanted to, surely we can't just have a venting session here, but it needs to be aimed at edification. Speak to whatever it is, this animating force that just made those in leadership so confident that the only problems they had were you and people like you, and that were it not for you, the United Methodist Church would be bursting at the seams, and now that you're gone, it's all going to grow. No self-reflection, no acknowledgement of failure in the past, no acknowledgement of failure even in the moment. Speak to that, because that's what is just unfathomable to me.
Right. Well, I apologize if I repeat myself, but it was fascinating. There was no moment of saying, folks, we're going to have to do church really differently. We've been looking closely. We lost 25% of our churches, some of our biggest churches, some of our most entrepreneurial pastors came to the conclusion that they can no longer live in this big tent. What did we do to create that environment? How do we make certain that we don't create that in the future? Nobody said, the United Methodist Church has lost membership every year since it's been in attendance, since 1968, every year. Nobody said, we're going to have to do things differently. Nobody said, maybe most organizations think that they rise and fall on leadership, because that's reality. Good leaders produce growing, thriving organizations and institutions. The United Methodist Church has failed ever since it was formed in 1968. Nobody said, what kind of leaders do we need? How do we need to do things differently? I think that, it was even said, I'm more hopeful than ever. So let's see, you've cut your budget by 40%. You've gotten rid of 25% of your churches, some of your most entrepreneurial pastors, and you're more hopeful than ever. Why? Well, because you got rid of us. Not because you've discovered something new. You've come up with a new plan, a new strategy, a new God-given vision for how to reach the lost. So what is your hope? And see, hope is not a strategy. It's not a plan. It's not a vision. And when it's hope against hope, it's really a very poor way to move into the future. But progressives, again, I don't like to overly generalize, but I think this is a generally true statement. Progressives live in a narrative of victims and villains. And what they've been able to tell themselves is the reason that they've not been good about reaching the culture is because we had these villains, people like myself, like you, like others, who have given all this misinformation, have told these untruths about the United Methodist Church, and who have sown division. Of course, the United Methodist Church was a failing institution long before I began my ministry, long before you were ordained or you began your podcast. Mm-hmm. So the lack of being willing to look at yourself. When I was preaching regularly, one thing I always used was that the key, the foundation of all growth is being honest with yourself, about yourself, and being honest with God about yourself. And I see none of that with these people. But they're going to have to face that, because we're not going to be there any longer for them to point the finger at and to be the villain in this narrative that they've created. And they're going to be left with themselves, and they're not going to grow. To think that they are, to be more hopeful than ever, when every mainline denomination that has made this change has then seen between a 20 and 30% decrease in membership. The Episcopal Church, one of their church growth experts, said that at this rate, the rate that they're going, they will not have anyone in worship by 2050. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, one of their church growth experts said by 2041 they'll have 16,000 people denomination-wide in worship. And so to think that somehow our progressives are going to be smarter than their progressives, our progressives are going to be more anointed, more spiritually discerning, more passionate for the gospel, that's just the height of hubris, to think that somehow our team is better than these other teams and that we'll crack the nut of reaching this culture that other progressives have not. So they are no longer going to have us as their villains. They're going to have to face the fact that a progressive gospel does not transform lives. It does not meet the deep spiritual longings within the human heart. And they're going to discover that, and this is not a fair statement for many remaining United Methodist churches, but it's true of many of them. They're going to discover that just because you start marrying gay people, that secular folks are not going to start getting up early on Sunday morning, going to a worship service, singing a bunch of songs that they can't relate to, giving 10% of their income to the work of God, and commit their lives to taking up a cross, dying to themselves, and following Jesus. That's not going to be the change that renews the church. So they need to start asking questions. Why do we not take evangelism seriously? Why, when all we talk about is making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, why are we so bad at making disciples, and why have we done so little to transform the world? Hopefully, they will have that moment that, and I'm not comparing them to alcoholics and addicts, but for real transformation, you hit rock bottom, which the UMC will continue to get closer and closer to, and you have a moment of clarity. And you say, the problem is in me. I've got to be changed. And quit pointing the finger at others who you think you can pass the blame to. So that's my projection for the United Methodist Church.
Well, and you're probably right. And I've tried to, so whenever I was live streaming Plenary, there was time for me to try and explain, like, what is the ideology undergirding this? And for conservatives looking at it, we're just going, what are they doing? They're killing themselves publicly in front of everybody. Do they not see the ELCA? Do they not see the Episcopalian? And so, right now is what a liberal would look at and see echo chamber talk, where, of course, you and I both agree on what's happening. But I'm going to do something with you. I might take this out. And I don't think you don't know this, but a lot of our viewers, I think, probably don't. This all goes back to Marxism. And of course, Marx presented a theory that there would be a critical mass reached in industrialized nations where the working class would all at once rise up against the bourgeoisie and have an overthrow. And that in the meantime, agitation was the order of the day until they reached that critical mass. Mm-hmm. And it didn't work that way. There were a couple places that tried it. It didn't come out that way, so you would think that they would have the good sense to turn back on that ideology, but it has a demonic root that has metastasized over time, and there have been different iterations over time. Right now, what they're animated by would be properly understood as neo-Marxism, where their goal is perpetual revolution, and they're aiming at a critical mass being reached where, okay, it hasn't worked at any time, but if we keep pushing, if we keep boldly trusting, I referenced Field of Dreams in my analysis last week. There's this notion that the critical mass will be reached and all of a sudden things will fit into place in a way that never could before, but it can only be realized if we burn our boats and we go in the direction that we have to boldly together. And that's what they've done, is they've burned their boats. They've chased out the only people that tethered them to historic Christianity, and they believe that they are creating something new, that God is going to, whatever God is to them, is going to bless it, and that's what's being put on trial. We're going to see. I think they're wrong. You think they're wrong. But what I think people don't understand is they are animated by a spiritual force that is very different from the God of the Bible, and they've made that abundantly clear in the last couple of weeks. You're acting like you agree with me. So all this fits in your head too?
Well, you'll know more about the how Marxism plays in here. What's obvious is that it is a rebellion against proper authority. And the way that you do that is to create victims and villains. You create an underclass. You convince them that there are authorities that are oppressing them and don't care for them, and that they have to rise up and take over. And the narrative is just amazing. When you look at all that Orthodox Christianity has done for people for centuries, lifted people out of poverty, did more to promote women's rights, the rights of children, the forces of democracy and good and civility. No one but an intellectual fool or a historical idiot would somehow say that Christianity has been this force that has kept great and good changes from occurring. It's been just the opposite. But somehow people have become brainwashed and misled into thinking that the gospel, the traditional gospel of Jesus Christ, is now some oppressive force. And what will happen, I think you'll agree here, Jeff, when you throw that over, you don't create a long-lasting vacuum. Something comes in that wants to take control and will take control. Take control of the words you can use, of the thinking that is appropriate, and these will be the same people who say they are all for freedom, but you will never find a more controlling group of people than those right now who are promoting a progressive ideology, the group that feels good about canceling people because their ideas don't match up with the current politically correct view on things. So it'll just be very interesting to see how they do this, because there's no stop on the left. They're never going to get to a place and say, well, that's as far as we can go, because anything other than that would be non-orthodox.
Right.
Or anything other than that would be wrong theologically. There'll be the ones in the United Methodist denomination that will have the most energy will be those who continually keep pushing, and some of our centrist statesmen who have said that they're going to be there to not let things go too far. They're going to find themselves the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike as this wave of progressivism comes crashing on them. They were never there when we were willing to fight the fight with them. They never got their head up and said, hey, that's too far. And so the idea that they're going to fight that battle now that we're gone, and they're going to be the bad guy, and they're going to be the defender of orthodoxy, it's not going to happen, man. So I am very pessimistic. I hope God proves me wrong. I hope God does something in the United Methodist Church that I find difficult, if not impossible, to believe. But I am not hopeful about its future. The leadership is not good. The theology is not good. The trajectory is obvious and evident, and you can just see where this is headed.
Well, in pitching us in that direction, I said I wanted it to be for the good of what I'm trying to build up, the denomination I've associated with, the Global Methodist Church. And then one cannot help but wonder at you personally. You're still United Methodist clergy affiliated with the United Methodist Church. What on earth are you going to do, brother?
Well, I share the same concern. You asked me to speak about UMC in General Conference, and so I'm happy to do that. I'm not stalking my ex, as somebody's written on X on Twitter.
That was Jeremy Smith, yeah.
Yeah, of course it was. The point that I want to make is I've talked about the UMC because you asked me to, but no denomination, not even the GMC, is going to have it easy in reaching the culture. Okay, we've got headwind. We don't have home field advantage anymore. We don't have a neutral playing ground. We have a negative context that we need to bring the gospel to. So you asked me what I'm going to do. Very shortly, I'll make an announcement about where and when I'm leaving the UMC to join the GMC. And we'll be very happy to be a part of that. I was one of the creators of it and stayed in the UMC so I could go to this last general conference and not be a part of another denomination saying what the UMC should do. So I'll be heading to the GMC soon. But that will be the totality of my efforts there. How are we going to reach this culture? And I think what we know is that we've got to find a way to join together grace and truth. We've got to tell the truth because truth sets you free, but we've got to find a way to tell it so that it is not just in the way we say it, but in the way we live it, the way we serve others. The way that we become known is not those people who are shaking a finger in our face, but those people who are putting an arm around my shoulder. When people think of Christians not as those who vote a particular way, but of the Christians in my city, those are the ones who care more than anybody else. So those are the ones that are working with single mothers and with addicts, and those are the ones who are feeding the poor. When they begin to think that's who Christians are, that's when we'll get a hearing again. I'm as concerned as you are that we find a way for the GMC not to be open to any kind of theological drift. I feel good that we will have those safeguards there. We've got to be good about being a truly global church, and if we do that, we'll be better in the U.S. because what people are doing in the developing world will rub off on us, and there is a ton that we can learn from them. But we've got to be people who are servants and who are here to crucify ourselves, die to our comforts and our ease so that we can serve those who are truly poor and struggling and needy. And if we can pull that off, I say if, because man, that is hard. That's Wesley saying, when you first came to Christ, you didn't have anything, you were desperate, you were centered on Christ, that was your life, but he didn't use these words. Now that you got a piece of the pie, now that you're middle class, I fear you're going to get satisfied with that and you won't have that passion for Christ and the gospel. And that's where we are. And we've got to go back to that first love and that first desire to serve Christ. But if we can do that, then I think we have a chance of reaching this culture because people need the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Well, and I'll say very flatly, that's where my passion for PlainSpoken is, and I'm simultaneously wanting to be happy with you that you are confident in the safeguards that the GMC has in place, but I just know that things always start one place, and then there are certain forces of entropy that act upon every institution. Yeah. And so it's my intention to continue doing what I'm doing in hopes that I can be a small purifying agent for something that is started with great intentions. And that is something that I know a lot of people right now are wondering about. There was you personally, and there's also good news where there's been a long-standing invitation to the United Methodist Church, a call to holiness that has now been issued a final resounding no. Right. And yes, there is precedent in the United Methodist Church for resounding answers to be turned on deaf ears, as happened in 2019. I don't get the sense that you guys are going to continue to antagonize the way that progressives did in the UMC. So is there going to be any kind of, and if you can't speak to this, that's fine, but people can't help but wonder is there going to be a good news in the GMC?
No. So the reason Good News was created is because whether you call us Orthodox or biblical Christians or evangelicals, we didn't have a voice, and so Good News was that voice. But the GMC is us, okay? The GMC is that voice now become a movement within the UMC, and now has become a new church body. So honestly, we did have some people who said we need to continue just for the reasons that you're concerned about, because institutions, movements do begin to drift over time, and it was like, hey, we need to be around to be a check. And it was like, how do I present that to people? Hey, this new denomination that we began and that's populated with our friends and people that we trust, and we told you that you should join. Yeah, well, it may go bad in a few years, so continue to send money so I can get a salary and Tom Lambrecht can be employed. I just thought, one, I don't see that being a very effective letter, and two, that's not what I believe. I want you, Jeffrey, to continue to be who you are and to do the work that you're doing, because I want to, unlike maybe last shot ever on the UMC, unlike the lack of self-awareness that we see in them, I am aware enough to know that I can be blind to myself, and that good people, which I think is characteristic of the UMC, good people can be blind to themselves, to their desires, to their drift, to their inclinations. And it's always good to have a friend on the outside looking in and saying, hey, brother, let's look at this. The story was told of Harry Truman after he replaced FDR. A friend came to him and said, Harry, now that you're the president, you're going to be surrounded by a lot of men, and they're all going to tell you the same thing. They're going to tell you how wonderful and how great you are. You just remember there's two of us that know you ain't. So it's good for a friend to come and say, hey, guys, you don't have it all together. You're not who you say you want to be, and to have good criticism. So I need that. The GMC will need that. We think we'll do a good job of watching ourselves, but it's always good to have a friend with a microphone saying, hey, guys, look at this. So I want you to continue your work. But the work of good news will conclude not tomorrow, not next month, because we still want to help churches in the U.S. that want to get out. I'm going to West Virginia this weekend to speak to a group of churches there who find themselves caught now when they can see where the UMC really is. Good news is not going to exist forever, but we're not going out of business tomorrow or this month or even next month. We still want to help churches that find themselves trapped here, that want to find a way out. We helped a lot of churches in the past find their path. And we still want to be very committed to our brothers and sisters overseas and try to do everything we can to help them. So we're not going to exist forever. We'll make an official announcement pretty soon, I think. But we still have work to do that we feel God's called us to and that we want to fulfill, so we can really believe that we fought the good fight, we've run the race, and we've completed the task that God has given us.
Very good. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your kind words about what I'm doing, and thank you so much for your long service to the body that we cared so much about. And I'm very glad that we're going to be in a new body in the Global Methodist Church together. So God bless your ministry and retirement, and I hope you do get some relaxation. And you need to run, and we need to say goodbye to our viewers. So viewers, thank you so much for spending time with us, and say a little prayer for Rob. He's got some work to do yet. All right. See you, friends.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.